Hello, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. So I'm Xavier Pasco, and I'm the director of FRS, Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique. It's a leading French Paris-based think tank on defense and security issues. And I'm very happy to welcome you for this webinar. It's entitled Enhancing Collective Security in Outer Space, Challenges and Opportunities at the Dawn of the New Space Age. So this webinar is part of a series of distant events organized in cooperation with the US Embassy and Consulates in France. And I would like to seize this opportunity to thank again our partner on this and for their support and in helping develop a transatlantic perspective on strategic issues of common interest. And space is certainly one, I would say. And so I would like now to give the floor to Mr. Michael Turner, who is Counselor for Cultural Affairs here at the US Embassy in Paris for introductory remarks. So Michael, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Xavier. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you today for a webinar with three prominent experts on enhancing collective security in outer space, challenges and opportunities at the dawn of a new space age, organized by our friends at the Fondation for Strategic Research in partnership with us here at the American Embassy. The Embassy has a long tradition of working with the Foundation for Strategic Research to bring American perspectives to France and to encourage dialogue between our two peoples. Today, we will look at pragmatic ways to ensure long-term, sustainable space activities. Space is a crucial and strategic issue for the United States and for Europe. And there is an urgent need to put in place regulations at the global level that we can all agree on and support. So thank you for joining us today, and back to you, Xavier.
So thank you again, Michael, for this and for this the kind support for putting this all alive and helping us on this. So I would start this by giving a few words of introduction to our topics today. Space activities, in my view, and I think in the view of our guests now, has drastically changed over the recent years, both in numbers and in types of players. And I would like to just give the audience a few figures to get the measure of things. Between 1957 to 2017, over 60 years, 8,000 satellites have been launched. Mostly were governmental. And in 2023 alone, 2,800 satellites have been launched only in 1 year, and less than 300 were governmental. Just to give a perspective of the changes in this domain, which has been very, very important in nature and in form. In 2018, there were 2,000 functional satellites in service. In 2024, 6 years after that, we have more than 10,000 functional satellites in orbit today. Some private actors are launching several times more than their own government, and this is the case for SpaceX, for example. We all know this very famous launch company, US-based launching company. But also we have a heavy governmental activity. If we look at China, for example, there might be something like 100 launches during the year 2024. And in parallel with these developments, these changes, the militaries of major countries are increasingly dependent on space-based resources for their military operations. And for example, for France, from the fight against terrorism in the Sahel, for example, to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, it's easy to see how important satellites are to security and defense. And this increased dependence raises the question of in-orbit security in a rapidly changing environment, whether in terms of safety, with the issue of debris in particular, or security with space now potentially becoming a military terrain, a military battleground, hopefully not. It can be noted that in the major spacefaring nations, new military programs and organizations have been set up to take account of this new dimension. Though the aim now is to protect satellites from attack, potentially to dissuade or to deter potential adversaries from attacking space assets while trying to keep space immune against a new military race. So in this increasingly complex environment, the question of collective security in space is clearly key, with such notion as sustainability, transparency, or responsibility having a central role. Well, this question has fed the international debate for years, with now a very clear divergence of views within the international community on how to advance coexistence in space and limit the prospects of possible escalation. So to discuss these highly topical issues and provide us with an informed perspective, I'm delighted really to welcome two very much esteemed colleagues and very well-known specialists in the space security policy. Would like first to introduce Victoria Sampson, our first presenter today. Victoria is the Chief Director, Space Security and Stability for Secure World Foundation, and has over 25 years of experience in military space and security issues. And before joining Secure World Foundation, Mrs. Sampson served as a senior analyst for the Center for Defense Information, CDI, where she leveraged her expertise in missile defense, nuclear reductions, and space security issues to conduct in-depth analysis and media commentary. And prior to her time at CDI, Mrs. Sampson was a senior policy associate at the Coalition to Reduce Nuclear Dangers, a consortium of armed control groups in the Washington, D.C. area, where she worked with congressional staffers, members of the media, embassy officials, think tanks on the issues related to ballistic missile defense and nuclear weapon reduction. I have also the great pleasure to welcome Professor James Clements as our discussant today, I would say. Clay is the professor at the Department of National Security Affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School, where he holds also a joint appointment in the Space Systems Academic Group. Clay has had a distinguished career both as an academic and as a space specialist, I would say. From September 2020 to March 2022, Professor Maltz served as Dean of the Graduate School of International and Defense Studies at the Naval Postgraduate School. From 2018 to 2020, he served as the chairman of the Department of National Security Affairs at NPS. And from 2012 to 2016, he was the National Security Affairs Department's Associate Chair for Research, while also directing the Center on Contemporary Conflict and the Project on Advanced Systems and Concepts for Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction, funded by the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. Professor Maltz also worked previously in the US Senate at the University of California, San Diego, at the Monterey Institute of International Studies, Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, where he was the founding editor of the very well-known journal Non-Proliferation Review. And also, among his numerous publications, Professor Maltz published recently, or republished, I would say. I would quote two books among many. The Politics of Space Security, Strategic Restraint, and the Pursuit of National Interest, and the Stanford University Press. It's been republished in 2019, I think. And another one republished this year at the Columbia University Press, Crowded Orbits, Conflict and Cooperation in Space. And I think these topics are right in line with our discussion today. Before we're getting to the heart of the matter, just as a quick reminder, we are going to listen to our two guests before discussing the various points that have been raised. The last word for our audience. Please feel free to ask your question in the reserved section using the reserved section for Q&A here, and I will make my best to reflect your questions in our discussion. So with no further ado, I will now hand it over to Victoria for setting the stage and give us her thoughts on this issue. So Victoria, you have the floor.
Well, while you're doing that, just allow me to say hello and good evening, Paris. Thank you so much, FRS, for inviting me to be here, and thank you for the U.S. Embassy in Paris for co-sponsoring this event. I will say I was an intern at the U.S. Embassy in Paris about 1 million years ago. It was so long ago. It was pre-Euro. It was back when they were using the franc. So I have very fond memories of the embassy and the community there, and it's a real delight to be back.
All right.
And looks like we are up.
Are you?
Yes, I can see my stuff. So
Uh,
yeah. Oh,
yeah. Okay. I just.
it just went away.
All right.
There we go. Now it's up.
Very good.
So yeah, so as Xavier said, my name is Victoria Sampson. I'm the Chief Director of Space Security and Stability for the Secure World Foundation. I'll be going over just kind of a big picture examination of issues affecting space security and stability and a little bit of the multilateral context. Next slide, please. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Secure World Foundation, we are a US-based nonprofit that focuses on the long-term sustainable use of outer space. We promote best practices and norms of behavior to make sure that space is accessible to and usable for all over the long term. So our vision is a secure, sustainable, and peaceful use of outer space, again, looking at how it affects life on our planet for global stability. And we work with all stakeholders, governments, industry, academia, civil society, to develop and promote ideas and solutions, again, looking at the secure, sustainable, and peaceful uses of outer space. Next slide, please. Okay, so just kind of to set the stage, yeah, I think you can click through, I think, 3 times. So a lot of times when people, and then one more. Thank you, Xavier. So again, when we're talking about space, oftentimes people think of what's in orbit, which, makes sense. The satellites are obviously a key part of our space capabilities. But just, to emphasize that a space system is much more than just the satellite. You have the ground segment, which is the part that receives the information or sending information that's going to and from orbit. You have the user segment, the people actually doing those things. And then you have the internet or, cyber communications allowing people to get access to those capabilities. So any part of this triad or quad that is interrupted can interfere with your ability to use space. So it's not just the satellites, it can be the ground segment, it can be users. And we actually have seen these done in conflict. Next slide, please. And just to underline as well, the space environment is a hugely complicated environment. It's gotten even more so over the past several years in terms of new actors, new activities, and just numbers have gone up. As of November 3rd, so a couple days ago when I was looking at this, the total number of active satellites, Xavier already talked a little bit about this, but the total number of active satellites is about 10,600. I'm bumping it up a little bit because I know SpaceX launched again yesterday, so the numbers are higher. So of those 10,000, roughly 600 active satellites, the United States has 7,517. So 3/4 from the United States. But of that, SpaceX Starlink is 6,504. So you can see just one single actor has about 2/3 of the active satellites in orbit. And it's not a state actor, it's a commercial actor, which again is a huge shift in the domain, which had been historically dominated by nation states. And it's been a relatively recent shift too. SpaceX just started launching their satellites 5 years ago. And that's really what upended, I think, the governance mechanism for space. In terms of active satellites, Russia has about 274, so you can see a lot less. China has about 904. I didn't put in the slide, but France has about 60. So just get a sense, the numbers there. There's a lot going on there in terms of actors and new commercial entrants. As well, in terms of active satellites, you have either non-active satellites or pieces of debris in orbit. And so that can be anything that was human-made, but not actually an actually functioning satellite. So rocket engines, pieces of material from an anti-satellite test, what have you. These numbers here in terms of orbital debris are from the European Space Agency. And so, there's a couple iterations. We have larger than 10 centimeters. There's about 40,000 pieces of debris in Earth orbit that are larger than 10 centimeters. So that's about the size of a softball. And so if those were to impact a satellite, that would create definitely new debris at that point. That's the speeds are moving in orbit so fast that they would definitely be a real danger to any active satellite or any human in orbit. If the orbital debris is a diameter between 1 and 10 centimeters, there's roughly over a million, it's at 1.1 million, it's really a guesstimate at that point. So if those at that size, which is, pretty small, but again, at the number, the speed of which they're operating, they're orbiting, they can cause major damage if they impact another spacecraft. And then smaller than 1 centimeter, and that's a real guesstimate, 130 million. I mean, that's something we're guessing on. It can cause damage. The U.S. space shuttle has a very famous picture where the windshield got hit by a paint chip. and it basically put a divot in the windshield that was it could be damaging. So the concern here is that larger than 10 centimeters, we can mostly see from, we have it's called space situational awareness. There are mostly ground-based radars and telescopes, although there's trying to be more satellites that have this capability as well, that can track objects in orbit. But between 1 and 10 centimeters, it kind of depends which orbit you're looking at. To grossly oversimplify, the farther out you go, the harder it is to see smaller objects, right? But the ones we can't detect, that's the real concern, is that they're small enough you can't see them, but they can still cause damage. So again, you can see the idea that there may be damage happening to satellites, and you don't know necessarily if it's because it was impacted by a piece of orbital debris, because it had been interfered with in a deliberate manner, because there was a solar flare, because someone forgot to carry the tube when they were working on the engineering for the satellite. It could be a whole host of issues. And so you can see as well, when there's geopolitical competition and I guess stress on Earth, that it's very easy that some sort of misunderstanding in space could inadvertently escalate. And that could be a real concern for stability in space and the stability on Earth as well. Next slide, please. Another thing that could cause inadvertent escalation, I have close approaches and effects on space sustainability. So not every satellite can do this, but I know the United States, Russia, and China have all done this with their own satellites. We call it uncoordinated close approaches, the idea that you get up close to another country's satellite without coordinating with them first. And so, generally speaking, it's considered bad form to do that sort of thing, but oftentimes countries like to do that if they're trying to gather intelligence on the other country's satellite, on the communication that they're sending or receiving, or just get a sense, possibly even to deliberately interfere with them. So you can see there can be inadvertent escalation. And if they're getting up close and you're not entirely sure about the intent, it's really hard to figure out intent just from actions. Oftentimes you need behavior and statements as well. And so you say, maybe if you're new to this, you might say, well, okay, if it's, so destabilizing to go up close to other country satellites, just make a rule you can't get within a certain number of kilometers, what have you. That's not quite so easy because, again, just due to the orbital dynamics of the space environment, you can actually be far away from another satellite, but you can get up close very quickly without using a lot of energy, and that could be destabilizing as well. And also just different actors have different comfort levels in terms of how close they want other actors to be. You can imagine if you have a nuclear command and control satellite, you want actors very far away. But if you have a satellite that's just taking images of Earth and you have hundreds or even thousands of others just like them, you say, well, if someone gets up close, I'd lose a satellite. It's not going to make that big a deal. Or you might say, okay, we have humans on this spacecraft. We definitely want a safety zone around it. So different actors have different perceptions of threat and they have different perceptions of risk. So you can see, again, this is a way in which you may have inadvertent escalation if you have these close approaches. So I say, it's very few and hard rules about what is and is not allowed. You're trying to demonstrate intent. How do you do that? Do you make announcements ahead of time? Do you coordinate? Obviously, you're not coordinating, so you can't do that. But are there ways in which you can show, okay, by these behaviors, I mean, ill will, or I'm neutral. And the other way, if you have these, close satellites getting close to each other, how do you determine right of way? This used to not be an issue, but as you get orbits more, cluttered and complicated, the idea that used to be the space is big, we're fine, we don't need to do this sort of thing. But now you may need to think about that. So for right of way, is it the bigger satellite? Is it the younger satellite? Is it the satellite that has a certain mission? Can all satellites even maneuver? And even if you're trying to coordinate right-of-way issues, how do you communicate that amongst various actors? And then finally, the last point I make on this slide is that the idea of, understanding human activities in space and objects in space. And that's, generally speaking, big picture, what space situational awareness is. It's good, but it has its limitations. Most of the US SSA capabilities are lingering from the Cold War. They were ground control radars and telescopes that were built to see if there are any Soviet ICBMs coming over the horizon, over the North Pole. So you can imagine South Pole coverage was limited. It's getting better. But then also it's really good at identifying where things were, not necessarily where they're going to be. So, and then even so, oftentimes if you're looking at basically pixels and you're trying to identify, okay, are these pixels doing different things than what's typically done, what's considered normal behavior, and is this atypical? How do you figure out these sort of things? So it can be helpful, but it's not the only resource to do these capabilities. Next slide, please. So a lot of what I'll be talking about today as well is in talking about the threat environment. My organization puts out an annual report called Global Counterspace Capabilities, an open source assessment. We use unclassified open source material to look at counterspace capabilities around the world. The reason why we started it is that, the existence of counterspace capabilities is not new. Counterspace has been in space as long as humans have been. But the circumstances surrounding them are, in that we have, as I said, new actors, new emphasis on space as a key national security enabler. And so there's, space is part of a lot of countries' economic systems. And so as countries become more dependent upon space capabilities, there's more of incentive to interfere with it, deny, disrupt, destroy, what have you, those capabilities. And so what we see is there's, kind of big picture, there's a significant amount of research and development, even testing, a wide range of both destructive and non-destructive counterspace capabilities by many countries. But if you take one thing away from this conversation, we'll point out that only non-destructive capabilities are active being used in current military operations. So just contextualize that. I will point out as well, you can see the URL on for the counterspace report on our website, swfound.org/counterspace. We have the book there. It's in English, but we have the executive summary translated into all 6 official UN languages, which of course includes French. As well, this year we added Portuguese and Japanese. Next slide, please. So when we're talking counterspace capabilities, what exactly does that mean? Because if you read various assessments, different organizations have different ways in which of describing them. So we look at 5 different capabilities for the countries that we include in our report. The first one is the idea of a co-orbital counterspace capability. That's when your system is put into orbit and then it maneuvers to approach its target, and that's going to interfere with it in some way, shape, or form, whether it's going to try and destroy it, it's going to try and jam it, it's going to just look at it, what have you. Then you have direct ascent, where you have terrestrial-based missiles, whether they're ground, air, sea, and they're launched. Interceptors are used to kinetically destroy satellites through the force of impact, but they do not go into orbit themselves. Next, you have directed energy, where you use some sort of focused energy, microwave beams, laser, particle, to somehow interfere or destroy space systems. You may have heard news stories earlier this year talking about Russia possibly developing a nuclear weapon that would be used in an anti-satellite capacity. The electromagnetic pulse, or EMP, from that would definitely be a directed energy weapon. I'll go into a little bit more detail about that later on in this presentation. Electronic warfare, basically jamming, using radio frequency interference to somehow interfere with or jam communications. Basically, everyone jams. That's something everyone has that capability of. And then finally, cyber, the idea of using software and network techniques to somehow interfere with computer systems. And we actually have seen that happen in conflict. And then finally, the 6th thing we look at for every country is space situational awareness. And again, you can think of many reasons why you want to keep track of objects in orbit that are not aggressive, that are not military in origin. But if you are going to be targeting other country satellites, an indigenous SSA capability is something that you would need. So that's why we look at it as well. Next slide, please. We call this our stoplight chart. So this is kind of the too long didn't read version of our counterspace threat assessment. Looks, the x-axis has all 12 countries that we include in this report, and the y-axis looks at various counterspace capabilities. I will point out, looking at the countries involved, you may notice that they are not done alphabetically, and that's done deliberately. We organize our report into 2 sections. 1, those countries have conducted destructive anti-satellite tests, and then 2, everyone else. We do that in the chronological order of which those tests occurred. So the first country to do this was the United States in 1959, and then Russia / Soviet Union, 1963, and then we have China in 2007, India in 2019, and the rest of the countries, Australia, France, Iran, Israel, Japan, North Korea, South Korea, UK, are just developing various counterspace capabilities. So you can see this is the legend. A green circle means, as far as we know, there's no capabilities being developed. A yellow square means some, a red triangles mean significant. And so it's a highly technical assessment that we look at. I mean, but it kind of gives you a big picture sort of idea. And you can see, okay, basically looking at this, everyone has some sort of SSA capability. Pretty much everyone has some sort of electronic warfare capability. When you get to the more destructive capabilities, whether they're directed energy, direct ascent interceptors, co-orbital, and we divide this up into various orbits, it kind of winnows down to those actors that have already conducted destructive ASAT tests. So again, and one thing I'll point out, I could probably spend the whole session talking about this, but I won't put you through all that. We don't include cyber as a breakdown for every country, and that's because even though space gets classified very quickly, cyber gets classified extremely quickly. And so basically what we do is we have a catch-all chapter at the end where we say, look, we know these countries have space capabilities. We know they've conducted cyber operations in other domains. So we assume that they probably have some interest in conducting cyber operations in space. And we can point to, for example, when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, it also did a concurrent cyber attack against Viasat's ground terminal. So we have examples of this being used in conflicts. Next slide, please. I like this chart because this looks at anti-satellite tests per year, and this is from the 2024 version. The colors, blue is US, red is Russia, yellow is China, green is India. And so we're looking at the x-axis goes, okay, from 1959 through present time, what have we seen? So in the first part of the space age, you can see there was a lot of blue and there was a lot of red. For the first decade or so, the only countries doing these anti-satellite tests were the United States and then Soviet Union. And then you can see it kind of dropping off as the Cold War went on. And then there's a 10-year period after the wall fell and the Soviet Union dissolved that there were no anti-satellite tests. And then it picks up again with a new actor, China, in 2005. And then you can see again, kind of an uptick cadence. So this just gives you a sense that, oftentimes you hear actors say, well, space used to be a sanctuary and now actors are acting in a bad way and now it's getting threatening. No, the anti-satellite tests were always part of the space domain. But you can see as well, it's quieting down for a while and then it's increasing. And so that could be concerning because as these tests go, they create debris. I'll go in more on that a little bit, but they also may be an incentive to actually attack each other's satellites. Next slide, please. I apologize, this is a bit of an eye chart, but the reason why I included this table 5.1 from our counter space report, what we do is we look at every single anti-satellite test that's created some sort of trackable orbital debris in space. And we say, okay, here's the date, here's everything we know about it. The three white columns are the ones I think are most interesting. We have the tracked debris that was created from that test, and that's important because there's debris that we can track, but there's debris, as I said earlier, that's too small to track. But it can still be very damaging. You can say how much of that debris is still in orbit, and then the total number of years. And you can see some of these tests, there's debris that was in orbit for 50 years. It's going to be up there for a lot longer. Some of the other tests, the debris was in orbit just for a couple years. A lot of it depends on what altitude the intercept occurs and how much debris and how big the satellite target was and that sort of thing that was created. Again, to grossly oversimplify, the closer you are to Earth, the more quickly debris will deorbit. That is to say, just get pulled back by the Earth's gravitational pull and burn up in the Earth's atmosphere. But just pointing out, through the beginning of the space age to now, anti-satellite tests have created over 6,800 pieces of trackable debris, and of which there's almost 3,500 still around. So you can see there's still a lot out there. And that's why the concern is, okay, we do not want to deliberately create debris in orbit because oftentimes it can take a little while to get to deorbit. Next slide, please. Another thing you often hear, sometimes when people talk about space threats and space stability, they say, well, any satellite can be a weapon. That is incorrect. Not every satellite can be a weapon. I mean, not every satellite has the maneuvering capability, has the targeting capability, has the energy to be able to do that sort of thing, the guidance to be able to do those sort of stuff. But if your satellite's designed for what we call servicing, whether you're going to go up to refuel another satellite, to inspect, to tow, to move it, what have you, anything active debris removal or number servicing, things like that. Satellites with those kind of capabilities might also be able to be used for a weapon. So you can see, it's kind of dual purpose. You don't know what the intent is because it can be used for military purposes, it could be used for civilian purposes, for destructive purposes, for non-destructive purposes. And that's why the idea of just knowing from technology, you really can't know intent. You need to have other things, behaviors, discussions, policies, things like that to get a holistic picture of the intent. Next slide, please. One thing I talked about earlier, nuclear detonation as an anti-satellite weapon. We know what can happen when a nuclear warhead explodes in space because it has been done. Both the United States and the Soviet Union during the first part of the first decade or so of the Cold War held about a couple dozen tests where they exploded nuclear weapons in orbit. And so we can see, okay, and I have a picture here from the Starfish Prime nuclear test, which is one the United States held in July of 1962. It was a 1.4 megaton warhead, so it was a very big warhead. Essentially, it knocked out about a third of the active satellites at that point. Granted, we were only about 5 years into the space age, but still. And it managed to, the EMP from it actually managed to knock out streetlights over 1,000 miles away, 1,000 kilometers away. So just kind of big picture though, when we're talking about what happens, it's not quite the same as a nuclear warhead exploding, on or in Earth or, within the atmosphere. For one thing, when you're in space, just really obvious, there's no air, so there's no shock wave. But there's a couple different things. You have kind of the first effect, and then you have the secondary effect. The first effect, if you have any optical sensors pointed in its direction, it can blind them. If you have the thermal pulse that's released, that it can, if it's satellites within line of sight in the various region, can be overloaded, and their circuitry systems can be fried or destroyed. The EMP release from that can damage satellites, as I said before. It can also affect terrestrial electronics, even power grids, depending on the size of the warhead, the altitude at which happens, where it is in relation on Earth, things like that. So that's the first tier. The second tier is, there's a lot of radiation that's released from this. And what happens is it gets trapped in these things called the Van Allen belts, or these belts of high radiation. There's a couple then that surround Earth. And basically the radiation gets there and bounces around. It takes a while to dissipate. And so as satellites go through these belts, they pick up more and more radiation. And now satellites are all built to handle a certain amount of radiation because they're in space. Yeah, you're not being protected by the Earth's atmosphere. But, essentially, if they're getting too much or they're getting more than they've been designed for, they can interfere. And so, there's the idea if a certain size nuclear warhead were to go off in space, it could take the better part of a year for it to dissipate for satellites in low Earth orbit, and maybe about a month or so for satellites in geostationary orbit. I'm sorry, I should have said before, low Earth orbit is anywhere from like 100 kilometers to 2,000 kilometers. And that's where most of the active satellites are right now, to be honest. And then geostationary is at about 36,000 kilometers. And that's where the exquisite nuclear command and control satellites are. That's where a lot of the satellite telecom satellites are as well. And then just kind of big picture, this is a huge violation of the Outer Space Treaty. The Outer Space Treaty is a foundational document from 1967, which contains principles that are very relevant to this day. It doesn't say a lot about military issues, but Article 4 is very clear. Weapons of mass destruction may not be placed in orbit. So just saying, if a country were to develop these sort of capabilities, it would absolutely be against the Outer Space Treaty. Next slide, please. Just bringing to your attention, contractually obligated to share my organization, the Skepticism Foundation. We have a handbook for new actors in space, and we just, as in 2 weeks ago, released a second edition. The goal of it is saying, hey, so you want to launch a satellite, here's the sort of things you need to be aware of and kind of the best practices and what's considered to be a responsible space actor. There's this thing called the Outer Space Treaty. There's this thing called the International Telecommunications Union. If you're going to be launching satellites, you need to be thinking of launch licensing. You need to be looking at spectrum allocation. If you're going to be operating satellites in orbit, there are technical best practices. It's considered good form to have some sort of end-of-life plan for your satellite, whether it's to burn up in Earth's atmosphere or get in an altitude where it won't bother other satellites. So that's what we look at. We talk about the fundamental principles, norms, best practices for responsible actions in space. Our second edition, we actually have an online version as well, and it has a lot more links that we think is more interactive. It's available on our website. Right now, again, this handbook, the second edition for the Handbook of New Actors in Space is only in English. The first edition is available on our website, and it's available in Spanish, Chinese, and French. We hope to also get this version translated soon, but it's there for anyone who might be interested in it. Next slide, please. And I am getting close to wrapping up, so I know I'm going over my time, but just kind of big picture talking about multilateral security discussions. For many years, space security and stability discussions at the UN were just stopped. There's a fundamental disagreement amongst the major actors about what is the nature of the threat and how best to respond. Russia and China and their allies focus very heavily that there is, deliberately created weapons that were going to be placed in orbit, primarily space-based interceptors for missile defense. And the best way, so that's a threat to space security and stability, and that they wanted a treaty, I'd say here, the Treaty for Prevention of Placement of Weapons in Outer Space, the PPWT, to deal with it. Whereas the U.S. allies for many years said, okay, there isn't really anything that necessitating a treaty. And then recent years have been focusing more on norms of behavior, the idea that space is cluttered and congested and contested. And so we need to figure out, okay, well, we don't necessarily need a legally binding approach. We need to figure out, okay, what do we identify as a international community as being responsible behavior in space? And that's where we're seeing a shift. There recently, the past 2 years, there was a working group that talked about norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior. It was a UN body. It was ideally wanted to work towards a consensus report. They did not come to consensus, but even through the conversations, you can see kind of convergence on many different issue areas. And like you considered bad form to deliberately create debris. It's considered irresponsible to do uncoordinated close approaches. There is an important need for rules of the road and the idea that you can do notifications and consultations before doing any kind of close approaches. Transparency competence measures can be helpful. And then over the past year, there's another legally UN group, the Group of Governmental Experts, that focus more on an international legally binding instrument on prevention of arms race in outer space, or PAROS. And so that's more traditional. And actually, we're able to come to consensus in a report that has a lot of different stuff in it, talk more about later. And then there's an upcoming another open-ended working group. So again, I want to bore you stupid with arcane UN arcanery discussions, but just so you know that these discussions are happening at the international level, and there is some slow but steady progress after many years of none, which I find highly encouraging. Next, and I believe last slide. Yes. So we have multilateral discussions, whether they're legally binding or non-legally binding. But there's also unilateral approaches that countries can take, and I'll just talk about this as a case study. So, destructive direct ascent anti-satellite missile test moratorium. In April of 2022, the United States made a commitment not to conduct destructive direct ascent anti-satellite missile tests, and that language was chosen very carefully. So you see, they're not looking at not developing the capabilities. They're just saying, we're not going to test this. The United States has since been joined by 37 more countries. This was partially driven by Russia had one of these tests in November 2021 that created over 1,800 pieces of trackable debris. The UN General Assembly had a resolution in December 2022 which supported this moratorium, encouraged more countries to do it. You see it passed pretty widely. 155 countries voted in support. And we're just seeing again, the idea of this moratorium is showing up in various international discussions about what's considered responsible behavior, and it's considered irresponsible to deliberately create debris in orbit. And part of this is because more countries are depending upon space and they don't want to destroy the environment which they're working on. But also, direct ascent anti-satellite weapons aren't really good military weapons. I mean, they're really hard to use. They're extremely escalatory. You have no plausible deniability in terms of whether you launched it. You can only take out one satellite at a time. So if you take out, if you're working on a constellation of many satellites, it doesn't really do much good to knock only one off. And then again, it clutters the environment in which you need to operate too. And so it's something that's losing its attractiveness in terms of military utility. And again, my organization coordinated industry statement support of this moratorium. We have 51 countries in 15 countries, including many French companies that have signed this. More information, please see our website. And with that, next slide, please. I think I'm done. I appreciate your time and energy, and I look forward to hearing both Clay and Xavier's remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Victoria, for this comprehensive panorama of the different issues and very current issues. You mentioned these UN discussions, and I have a number of questions for this and other things. But with no further ado, I will now hand it over to Clay. And Clay, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I just want to say that these remarks represent my own views and are not those of the U.S. government or the U.S. Navy. So first of all, thank you, Xavier, for the kind invitation and also for the introduction. And I also want to thank Victoria for an excellent overview, which makes my job much easier. Now, I want to start with some academic questions and then provide an historical context for our current situation. And then finally, I want to turn to some specific obstacles and opportunities in today's space security debates. So from a political science perspective, the challenge of negotiating international agreements is called a collective action problem. Countries don't normally want to limit their military potential and their freedom of action unless there's a really good reason to do so. State leaders are often highly reluctant to want to invest in the time and resources required for international negotiations, which can take years of work and often involves very difficult compromises. From history, we know that there are two main motivations to negotiate arms control agreements. First, an inability to keep up with a rival, either due to cost considerations, or to a technological gap. A second motivation is a fear that the result of the arms race will worsen a country's security situation. In regard to space, the first arms control agreement was the inclusion of the orbital environment in the 1963 Partial Test Ban Treaty. The decision to include space in the PTBT resulted both from fear that each capital might lose a space arms race and concerns that continued testing of nuclear weapons in space would worsen their overall security and national interests due to the loss of human spaceflight programs, communications satellites, and valuable military reconnaissance programs that had been launched by that time. On the US side, the viability of the treaty was supported by the launch of 2 Vela Hotel nuclear detection satellites in the fall of 1963, which allowed us to verify the agreement. In regard to the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, the main motivation on both sides was the fear that they might lose the moon race. Each side worried about how its interests might suffer if the other side got to the moon first and decided to either claim territory or to exploit the moon for military purposes. There were clear benefits for both the United States and the Soviet Union in locking in a non-militarized, non-weaponized regime for the moon. Both sides also believed it was desirable to formalize prior norms that had been included in the 1963 UN resolutions. One that banned the orbiting of weapons of mass destruction, which Victoria mentioned, and a second one that prohibited territorial claims in space and extended legal protections into the orbital environment. During the Cold War, the fact that there were only 2 major space actors clearly helped facilitate arms control. A consensus between only Washington and Moscow was needed to bring about an agreement. Given their common interests in using space for civil purposes and for passive military functions such as reconnaissance, the 2 superpowers gradually abandoned goals of space dominance in favor of the stability offered by enhanced space security. Today, we don't enjoy the structural advantage in terms of the low number of actors or the symmetry in terms of their space interests. The international system, as has been mentioned today, is multipolar and is much more complicated. This raises the costs of negotiation, verification, and ratification of any agreement. There are some 75 countries with satellites in space, and thousands of commercial companies are involved in space activities, services, and manufacturing. Now, the good news is that the vast majority of these actors have no military ambitions and want to develop rather than weaponize space. Still, a few countries seem to believe that early use of space weapons in a conventional conflict on the ground might serve their interests. China and Russia have not been supportive of even the most basic ban on kinetic anti-satellite tests. Russia even vetoed a UN Security Council resolution earlier this year that would have simply reaffirmed existing international law that bans orbiting of weapons of mass destruction. Unfortunately, they're not alone. India is an important country that has so far abstained from supporting the kinetic ASAT test moratorium. And it might not support a formal treaty either, especially if it believes that it will need to strengthen its counterspace capabilities in a future conflict with China. Also, several US allies have Aegis missile defense systems that they might wish to test in the future for anti-satellite purposes in case they feel threatened by adversaries. Finally, France has stated that it plans to deploy protector satellites. So would France support an ASAT test ban treaty or not? As a result, it seems that more work is needed before there's a strong international consensus to get a kinetic ASAT test ban treaty. But other mechanisms may be desirable, codes of conduct or other agreements not to conduct these tests. As Victoria mentioned, there are some positive signs. Several initiatives have emerged in recent years that are beginning to build norms among a growing number of states, which might someday lead to a treaty. This process began in 2020 when the United Kingdom introduced a UN resolution on responsible and irresponsible behavior in space. This effort has resulted in a number of useful international meetings, which Victoria mentioned. It was strengthened by the US declaration of a kinetic ASAT test moratorium in April 2022, which was followed by a related UN resolution that passed, as Victoria noted, 155 to only 9 opposed. That was quite impressive. Based on this UN voting, China and Russia seem to be increasingly isolated, along with a small group of countries, such as North Korea and Iran, and have adopted very unpopular stances. They are now seen by many countries as intentionally blocking an international consensus on space security. Notably, even the BRICS countries like Brazil have broken with China and Russia over this stance, showing that most countries want a safer space environment. There seems to be an emerging consensus on several key themes: that there should be no more kinetic weapons testing in orbit, that states need to reaffirm their existing commitments to the Outer Space Treaty and not orbit weapons of mass destruction into space, and finally, that if states do need to defend themselves, they should do so through non-destructive means that do not hurt the space environment. But formalizing these norms into an international treaty is likely to be a slow and gradual process. One test case of whether the international community is going to be able to cooperate or whether it will engage in conflict is the emerging moon race. More and more countries are developing plans to send spacecraft and possibly astronauts to the moon to engage in mining and set up permanent bases. There are risks that conflicts may emerge over finite lunar resources and locations. The failure of the 1979 Moon Treaty to gain widespread international support means that the rather vague regime outlined in the Outer Space Treaty is the only set of international law that guides states there. But while the claiming of territory is banned, the existing rules lack critical details about implementation, and they neglect to discuss at all such important activities as lunar mining. The United States has attempted to address these gaps by laying out a set of general guidelines in the Artemis Accords, which France has signed. But while the Artemis Accords lay out some useful concepts for deconfliction of activities, they still lack clear national and international procedures to implement them. And China and Russia have so far rejected them. So how might the international community begin to address these problems? Are there areas of common interest that might prevail? Maybe, but agreements are likely to have to wait until a resolution of the Ukraine war. Also, a Chinese decision in the next few years to invade Taiwan would certainly disrupt this process. In the meantime, it seems that we need to make progress in gathering technical information and convincing states of the need for stronger mechanisms for space security, whether that takes the form of codes of conduct, conventions, or formal treaties. We also need to strengthen verification mechanisms, possibly by enlisting the help of the commercial sector. This should help increase the cost of violating norms and agreements and increase the incentives for complying with them. This process will require the combined participation of academics, non-governmental organizations, international organizations, and the commercial sector. Some specific areas for progress might include the following ideas. First, improving Earth orbital and cislunar space traffic management. This is especially important in the context of managing satellite megaconstellations near Earth and increasing the transparency of activities in cislunar space. Second, reaffirming the principle of non-interference with nuclear-related verification, early warning, and command and control satellites in orbit. These protections played a critical role in helping to avoid US-Soviet space conflict during the Cold War. And they are essential today for avoiding possible escalation of space conflicts and preventing potentially catastrophic nuclear wars. This is in the shared interests of all nuclear powers, including France. Finally, as I mentioned, we should begin strengthening mechanisms for governing the moon. Some priority areas might include developing inspection procedures on the moon to ensure its non-militarization, developing search and rescue protocols in case of accidents involving astronauts, cosmonauts, or taikonauts on the moon, and building infrastructure for lunar observation, navigation, and communications to ensure transparency and increase incentives for good behavior. These measures are all clearly in the interest of all parties in space and might help to reduce tensions. In terms of persuasive force, it's important that the emerging coalition of the United States, its allies, and their commercial partners stick together. They represent the most powerful bloc of actors in today's space community. Their increasing success in space may help convince other countries that developing space and increasing space security is better than trying to dominate it militarily. But it will take hard work and outreach efforts to draw in countries like India, Brazil, and emerging spacefaring countries in the developing world, whose support will be critical to any future agreement. So let me stop here and see if you have any questions and turn the proceedings back over to Dr. Pascoe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clay, for this very large perspective also, and your two presentations are completing each other very nicely. There are already questions in our Q&R section. I will have myself a few. I've been very much interested, of course, obviously, by your two presentations, and I'm very eager to discuss a number of issues you mentioned. We talked about transparency at some point, and Claire, you mentioned that in the end of your presentation, and I fully agree with that. It sounds like we all, as spacefaring nations, agree that it's legitimate for any spacefaring nation to protect its space assets in orbit. And we all know that this is a process that could lead to more military escalation. I think we're in a situation today where the satellites themselves can become a target because they're very much associated with military operations and all that. And so the status of space has changed a bit. It's never been a real sanctuary, but it was quite managed by the two superpowers in the Cold War years. And we have now reached a moment when this seems to fade a bit and create this new tension in space. So I wanted to ask you questions about how do you see. Okay, if we take the space defense strategy, the French one, the document has been published in 2019. In this document, there is this notion of active defense and the notion that France finds it legitimate to protect its own assets if needed. Okay, so that's a military side of things. It sounds like there might be, and there should be maybe, a diplomatic side of it, which should be, okay, if we all recognize that it's a legitimate right for each country to protect itself, it should be at least operated in a collective responsible manner, which means that we will have to communicate more than we used to in order to exchange and to prevent escalation, misunderstandings, misinterpretations. How would you see such a platform? I don't know, such a new communication that we would need in space. Do you see these kind of things, rising possibly, and under which role? I don't know.
I mean, do you want me to? I could jump in unless. Let me just say a few things real quickly. I mean, first of all, I think this is already occurring. One of the things that large numbers of satellites have done is create coalitions of states, and they also have allowed different groupings. So, for example, France is now involved in the Combined Space Operations Center that the United States Space Force operates with a number of other countries. And we also are in a situation where what we're finding is it's much harder to attack these large constellations and to deny service than it was during the Cold War. And so we do have traffic management problems today, but we also have a situation of what I would call deterrence by denial. In other words, you can't easily, as Victoria mentioned, attack a single satellite and expect it to have any effect. If you attack a Starlink satellite, there are still 6,000 more Starlink satellites. It's not going to work. Similarly, with Earth observation, many of these constellations, such as Planet, have 200 satellites in orbit. Taking one out is not going to have any effect. And we're seeing this deterrent effect in the Ukraine war. Russia tested an anti-satellite weapon just before the war, but they haven't used it because it would be pointless. So I think that we're seeing a form of deterrence that's emerging in space. It may not always work, but so far it seems to be holding. The one other point I'll just make real quickly is the role of the commercial sector, because I think companies like Leo Labs, Exoanalytic Solutions, that are building these catalogs of space objects and are able to quickly identify actions that have been taken against satellites serves as a deterrent also, because no longer can countries think that what they're doing in space is going to be secret. And so I think that helps, provide a level of stability.
Yeah, just building on what Clay said, I mean, in terms of protecting your satellites, I mean, yes, everyone has the right to self-defense, but what does that mean? Right. And I think that's where the difference is. But, are you protecting your satellite if you put a jammer up next to it? So in case anyone approaches it, you can interfere with it. Are you protecting a satellite if you're going to have offensive capabilities to be able to, get out ahead of the game and attack a target before it even gets close to your satellite? Things like that. And so I think it's important to have a lot of discussions about what's needed and what is intended. And that's where the idea is obviously about transparency, sharing information about policies and strategies and priorities, budget numbers. I think that can be incredibly helpful. And that's one of the things that we included, and Secure World includes in our counterspace report when we know these sort of things, is say, okay, we have these activities by actors. What are their strategies say, and how does it line up for that? And it is surprising often how few countries have space strategies, especially ones that are active space actors with military space capabilities. That's changing. It's getting more of them are developing it, but it's not happening as much. And then in terms of, the idea of protecting maybe commercial satellites that are being used in military operations. I mean, again, the commercial sector has been the private sector has been part of space almost from the very beginning of the space age. The reason, Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty requires countries to authorize and maintain continuing supervision of their national actors in space. And this was a compromise, actually, because when they were negotiating it, the United States wanted the private sector to be allowed to be in space, and the Soviet Union did not. And this was a way in which to say, okay, they can be, but they're going to be, modulated a little bit. And then even in terms of, war, I mean, during the Gulf War, the 2001 Gulf War in Afghanistan, about 3/4 of the United States military communications are being carried by commercial actors. So again, this is not new. The idea that commercial sector is being used in the military. It's becoming much more, I think, aware, cognizant, what's going on with Ukraine and then in Gaza as well. You see, Starlink, which is a commercial constellation being used to carry military communications, to be using for targeting. We have commercial Earth observation constellations that are being used, taking images that are then being used, and again, targeting military discussions. So again, this is not new. And again, the idea that these commercial companies are considered lawful targets because they're being used in a military campaign. Yes, they are, frankly. That's something the commercial sector does not like to think about, but they are. But just because you're a lawful target does not mean that you can be attacked, as needed. International humanitarian law, the laws of armed conflict are pretty clear on these sort of things. In addition to being a lawful target, you have to act, with distinction to be able to distinguish between civilian and military. You need to be able to do it in a proportionate manner. It has to be military, useful and needed. It can't just be done just to be done. So that's another concern I would say that's something they're working out. How do these things apply? But it doesn't mean that they can be immediately targeted all at once. And then finally, I would point out as well, in terms of sharing information and transparency and confidence building measures, the United States, actually, U.S. military, shares information about any close approaches, what are called conjunction warnings, to all active satellite operators, and that's all around the world. And that's done as a matter of spaceflight safety. Starting a few years ago in 2009, when an active U.S. satellite was hit by a dead Russian satellite, they realized, okay, we need to share this information. So they give it, these notifications of close approaches to all actors, and it includes rivals like China or Russia. And I will say as well that the EU SST, the European Space Surveillance and Tracking System, has started sharing SSA data to non-EU members, and that's just within the past year or so. So I think that's encouraging. And, building that in with the commercial SSA players that Clay brought about, you can get a more comprehensive picture. Now, it doesn't mean all the SSA systems are going to agree. Oftentimes, they have there's no ground truth or one single truth for where objects are in space. But as you have more, actors involved, you can kind of figure out, okay, what is really happening up there, and that can be helpful as well. So I think there is a lot of room for discussion and these sort of things. It does not necessarily have to be done, in a treaty at the United Nations. You can just have best practices amongst the major space actors, and that can have trickle down effects to all major all space stakeholders.
Thank you, both of you. Before jumping to the questions from the audience, I have another one. You both mentioned, in a sense, positive signs for the UN discussions, I would say, mentioning possible convergence. I don't know how we can call that between the position of respective camps, let's say. Still, we have beyond this legally binding versus, regime thing. There's another, I would say, relationship with this. On the one hand, it's a capability-oriented kind of approach, and the other one is a more responsible behavior-oriented. How would you see this reconcile as an approach, I would say? It's mentioned in the first question, by the way. Uh, how far do you think we are from agreeing to this responsible, irresponsible behavior from the geopolitical standpoint? Do we all agree on what's good and bad means? So it feels like, it's more than a formal opposition, I would say, between the hardliners on the hard law and the soft law. It's more than that. How do you see this?
Well, I can be the first to take the first crack at that. I mean, to be honest, I don't think you're going to get 100% immediately an agreement. Some actors are not participating in these conversations in good faith. So they're there to stop the discussion from moving ahead. But that doesn't mean you can't have kind of a groundswell of support and say, okay, generally speaking, these are the sort of behaviors that we think are important and relevant for responsible space actors. And there's nothing taking the countries from participating in these international conversations, going back and domesticizing them in terms of national legislation and regulation. And, and then eventually, I think at a certain point, you get to where this behavior is considered kind of customary, behavior internationally. So I'm not as worried about, well, we can't get to 100%, so we might as well not even try. I don't think that's the way to do this. You don't want perfection to be the enemy of good enough. But then also in terms of, do you focus on capabilities or do you focus on behavior? I think that's tough because, again, as we've mentioned repeatedly, so much of the, space is dual purpose. It's the technology is the technology, generally speaking. It's going to be, it can be good or bad. It can be hostile or defensive. It can be military or commercial or civil. It's more what you're doing with it, And so that's why I think it's, capability is maybe part of the conversation. And I think it can be helpful to be transparent within, understanding concerns about national security considerations about what sort of, objects are up there and capabilities. But it's really going to come down to the behavior and what you do with it. That's going to, I think, set the risk agenda. And so that's where I would focus on it. I think it's more, what is your end goal here? Are you trying to get to 100% in a treaty? Okay, you're not going to get that anytime soon. Are you trying to get the major space actors to agree, or most of them to agree on what's considered responsible behavior? Okay, that's the start. That's how this happens. I will point out as well that treaties aren't just jumping out fully formed out of people's heads, like Athena jumping out of Zeus's forehead. I mean, it takes a while, right? And I will point out, for example, the Outer Space Treaty started off as a series of UN General Assembly resolutions that you had discussions, you had agreement. UN General Assembly resolutions are not legally binding. They're strictly majority. But eventually you were able to build upon that to create a legally binding treaty. So these can be complementary. They can, lead onto these discussions, but just because they're not going to be 100% and not legally binding immediately, I think there's still utility and helpfulness for all space actors. And frankly, all users of space data. Last thing I'll say is that every single person on this planet is a user of space data in some way, shape, or form. And so the idea of space security and stability, it's not just consideration for the geopolitical superpowers. It's relevant to every single actor, every single country, because, they depend upon space data and services. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll just add to that I think this comes down to a growing realization of mutual dependency on the space environment. And even in China, we're seeing, I think, some evolution of thinking about the desirability of space warfare because of China's growing dependence on space. They also have taikonauts in orbit on their space station. And so over time, it's going to be less and less attractive to use weapons, particularly in the near Earth environment. And I think that may drive countries eventually towards some sort of agreement. I think, if you think about the Non-Proliferation Treaty, it took decades for many countries to sign on to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so I think this process, may take a decade or more. But I think that the good news is that we're seeing the basic outlines of some of these agreements. And I think the fact that that vote on the anti-satellite test moratorium was 155-9. I mean, the 9 states are pretty isolated. And I think that, there are good reasons to believe that with large numbers of countries, behind these efforts to protect space, that eventually they will prevail. But we shouldn't expect this is going to happen immediately, but we should continue to build the evidence and the coalition that we need to make this happen.
Okay, thank you, both of you. I'm sorry here, I have an alarm that's just started, so we don't really know what's happening. So I'm just waiting for more information here. Just one thing, maybe in a few minutes left. I have some other questions here. And one is, with space security becoming such a complex and pressing issue, do you think having more technical experts directly involved could make a real difference? How could their hands-on knowledge help shape more practical policies and protocols for safer outer space? So how to involve technical communities? And do you feel like it's an important issue? And Victoria mentioned the handbook for the new space people. Do you feel like it's an orientation in this direction, a step in this direction?
I mean, we hope that's is a transparency and confidence building measure if you can get that proliferated across various space actors. But I mean, it's an interesting question. It's complicated because the way the United Nations talks about space, it's very strongly divided. You have the civil space discussions, spaceflight safety, things like that. And that's done in Vienna, Austria, at the United Nations Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, or COPUOS is the acronym. And then you have security issues, which are done at the Conference of Disarmament in Geneva or First Committee of New York. And so historically, a lot of the technical experts are speaking and participating at COPUOS. And then the ones that are dealing with the Conference of Disarmament are the arms control folks and disarmament folks. And arms control folks, they're more policy oriented. So it's been a challenge to get the technical folks involved, and though some countries have had them as part of their national delegations. And another part is getting the technical folks involved in the conversation. Again, the United Nations, it's in its name. They have, the participants are national state actors. And so some countries are a little leery about having technical, non-state actors involved in the conversation. They see it as diluting the conversation. Maybe they're taking up space or speaking slots or what have you that they believe should be reserved for state actors. I think that's changing. I will point out my organization puts together, we're a co-sponsor of a space security conference at the Conference of Disarmament every year with the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. It happens every September, and we have opened it up to anyone who can attend or is interested in attending, with the idea that you cannot just have the states talking to themselves. You need to have all actors involved in the conversation, commercial, civil, military, because they all have an effect on the security and stability of the space domain. So they all need to be part of the solution.
Yeah, I would just say very briefly that, I think there are large numbers of technical people already participating, and many of them coming from the commercial sector. And there's a lot of interaction, that we're seeing on, the Space Safety Coalition and a number of other commercial actors that want to act responsibly in space because they know that if the space environment is ruined, their business model collapses. And so, they want to, make a positive contribution. And I think we've seen considerable movement in the commercial sector over the last even 5 years, in this direction. So I see that the commercial sector will have an impact on the diplomatic discussions in creating best practices and helping to bring countries that might be reluctant to the negotiating table.
Yes, indeed. Another question about the Artemis Accords you mentioned, Clay. Are they opening the door for space territorialization, contradicting the space treaty? Uh, you mentioned this new kind of texts and body of law, I'd
Yeah.
say.
No, I don't think that they're territorializing space at all. In fact, if you look at the Accords, they specifically reject the notion that they would involve claiming of territory. What they do state is that countries and companies have the right to mine resources and to sell those resources or to use them on the moon. It does raise some questions, right? There's the notion of creating a safety zone. Now, this was not a U.S. created idea. This came out of discussions in The Hague among countries and experts saying that we need to have deconfliction. So we need to have some sort of safety zone. What needs to happen, and I think the U.S. government is aware of this, that we need to figure out how to do this in a way that is acceptable to all actors. And I think that's going to be an ongoing process. However, what we're seeing is that the countries now, 45 countries in the Artemis Accords, are meeting on a regular basis to try to work out those procedures. And again, fortunately, we're not seeing anyone mining today. It's going to take a few more years. And so I'm hopeful that we will be able to develop those rules and those procedures, before we actually have companies or countries on the ground or on the moon doing these sorts of activities. But there is a lot of work to be done. I mean, we are really in the first stages of this only. And so, it is something that is going to take time and real effort, and it is going to take cooperation from the commercial sector. But I'm encouraged at least that countries are trying to fix this problem.
Right. And just one last thing, so I know we're close on time. The Artemis Accords actually are based on principles that are in the Outer Space Treaty. They were not generated, generally speaking, they're how do they apply as we continue to evolve our use of space, how we do continue space exploration. And the things, that Clay mentioned in terms of, safety zones, that's done specifically because things are different on the moon. It's a different gravitational structure. Dust acts differently. It can go a lot farther than it can on Earth. And so if you get close to another base and your vehicle, your rover kicks up dust, that could have very strong effects and harm the equipment to the base. So these are coming from, kind of practical reasons in terms of the application of outer space treaty principles.
Yes. Indeed. Two last questions maybe in the time we have. One last about the moon. In cislunar space and on the moon, what is the worst case scenario you would want to avoid for sustainability and security? This is a very open thing, rather prospective. It's interesting to consider the cislunar thing. We usually tend to focus on the surface of the moon itself, but a lot of things will going to happen in between the Earth and the moon. And how do you see all these things? There's going to be a lot of logistics and moves and maneuvers and stuff like that on orbit things.
Yeah, I mean it's a complicated environment. We don't know a lot. For example, we don't have strong SSA is focused on Earth orbit. It's not focused on the moon. You have position, navigation, and timing. It's focused for Earth. It's not for the moon. So communications is going to be complicated. The orbits are different. There aren't really a lot of solid, reasonable orbits for the moon. Things like right now, we've already had times where I know the Indians, they have an orbiter that had to move a couple times because it was going to have close approaches with other orbiters. So we're already starting to have possible close approaches. So I think we're at the starting phase where we can really get ahead of the conversation and agree on what these best practices are from a traffic management perspective, from a spectrum perspective, before we have any kind of catastrophic incident.
I mean, as Victoria mentioned, I mean, the regolith on the moon is very volatile, and because of the limited gravity, you could end up with a situation where there are clouds of regolith in different parts of the moon that would take months or so even to settle. That would create problems for spacecraft that are orbiting the moon. So we really need to make sure that the mining that is done there is responsibly operated, and that countries, cooperate with one another. I mean, I think there are good reasons to think that they may do so once they get there. I mean, now, everyone's afraid someone's going to get there first and see some big advantage. I think that's probably not likely. I think this is going to be a slow process, a gradual process. I don't think profits are going to happen immediately. It's going to be very costly to invest there. And that may encourage countries to cooperate more than they are now. However, of course, as we see, people take their rivalries, from the Earth into space. And so if the situation on the Earth is very, combative, we may see it's more likely that there's conflict in space. And so again, how we get together or get along on Earth is going to matter in terms of how we get along in space.
For sure. I agree 100% with you. And maybe a last question because we are now limited by time, but not the easiest one, maybe about SpaceX and being by far the biggest operator in the world. Isn't SpaceX becoming the most important stakeholder in any future space traffic management regime? By the way, indeed, as seen from Europe, when you're dealing with a player who owns more than 7,000 satellites, let's say, and you have 12, let's say, and you want to discuss space traffic management rules, how do you do? And how do you have the credibility, I would say, to talk to an actor who has also an experience in managing this whole thing? And how do you see that? Because politically, it is really significant. I mean, from this political perspective.
It definitely is. And I think that's why, we keep hitting that the commercial actors need to be involved in these conversations because oftentimes they are the ones setting the precedent or setting the norm. SpaceX was the first one to reuse launch vehicles. They were the first, having lots of satellites in a certain orbital plane. And they're not the only ones. If you look at their plans for tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 satellites for these very large constellations. So, but it doesn't mean that they are necessarily going to be taking over. And officially, SpaceX is a U.S. company. And so the U.S. should be, as part of Article 6 obligations, authorizing and doing continuing supervision of their activities. So they should be able to, incorporate them in international discussions. But it is a change. And I think that's where the governance mechanisms have had a hard time keeping up. And that we've got a shift where, space is a common domain. When we have threats in common domains, we talk about the multilateral level, except in this case, we have a commercial actor, a non-state actor having such a huge role here. So it does complicate it, but it does mean that they can be part of the solution instead of just being part of the problem.
Yeah, I would also note that, this is a temporary phenomenon because we're seeing Kuiper and OneWeb, and then China's, Genesat or whatever constellation they put up. So, there will be other large constellations up there within 5 years. And so, SpaceX has a big lead now, but it won't last forever. What we've also seen is that, initially, Elon Musk talked about, putting up experimental satellites and just seeing if they failed or not. Well, he's changed his policies, since then. And now, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission of the United States, which governs satellites, has also changed the rules. So originally it was 25 years that you had to deorbit your satellite after end of life. Now it's just 5 years. And so, because Elon Musk has to get a license from the US government, those satellites have to deorbit within 5 years of end of life. And so that's a big change. And, we've seen also that now they have krypton thrusters, they have collision avoidance equipment on board. And so we're seeing SpaceX behave more responsibly. And I think that does set a good precedent for other companies that are going to be up there because they all know that if any of them starts a Kessler syndrome, where more and more debris starts hitting other debris and it becomes uncontrollable, none of them will be able to use space. And so that is the risk that everyone faces, and I think provides a major incentive to improve space traffic management.
And I think they know they're being watched very much from this perspective. I'm sorry I have to close this conversation, but it's really a great conversation. We have to finish. I'm sorry for the questions I was unable to reflect, but I think we got the spirit of both questions. So I would like to really thank you both very much for this very substantial and lively discussion. It gives good hope for future further discussions we will have. Victoria and Clay, we often interact. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for the audience. I'm sure it's been, I think it's a first of a series of, it seems to me, several discussions we should have on this in any format. So thank you very much. Thank you to all.
Merci bien.
Bye-bye,
Thank you very
Victoria.
much.
Bye-bye, Clay. And
Bye.
bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Bye.
you.